All right, so today we're diving into surrogacy in Mexico. It looks like you've sent over some really interesting research on this. I'm intrigued by how different their approach seems to be compared to, say, the US or Canada.
Yeah, it really is a different landscape,
Yeah,
and it's definitely attracting a lot of attention.
right. And we should probably mention up front that we'll be referencing this source, Surrogacy in Mexico Legislation Process Cost Clinics from oview.com a couple of times in our deep dive today.
Sounds good.
Okay, so one thing that really jumped out at me when I was looking through this stuff was the legal side of things. Mexico seems to have made some pretty big changes recently in terms of surrogacy laws.
They have. I mean, in 2021, their Supreme Court actually declared surrogacy a protected medical procedure. So essentially, it became legal nationwide. But the key thing to remember here is that each state within Mexico can still have its own specific regulations.
So it's not as simple as just like, okay, surrogacy is legal in Mexico, let's go. You really need to understand the details of each state.
Exactly. You can't just assume it's a blanket legalization across the board.
And the article even highlights a specific example, right?
Right. Tabasco, they've actually gone and prohibited foreigners from signing surrogacy contracts there.
Wow. So that's like the opposite of what we were just talking about.
It is. And it just underscores how important it is to be incredibly careful and to really understand the legal landscape in whatever state you're considering.
Okay, so that's Tabasco, where it's basically a no-go for foreigners.
Yeah.
But then you have somewhere like Mexico City, which is also mentioned in this source, that's actually implemented a pre-birth parental court order, which I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure what that entails. Could you break that down a bit?
Sure. So it's a pretty unique approach. It essentially lets the intended parents get legal recognition of their parental rights before the baby is even born.
Interesting. So is the idea there just to simplify things later on, like when it comes to getting passports and all that?
Yeah, exactly. It can really streamline the whole process, especially for international intended parents.
Okay, that makes sense. But I can't help but wonder, what are the potential risks involved here, especially for someone who's not familiar with Mexican law?
No, the risks can be pretty substantial if you don't know what you're doing. You could run into all sorts of issues with parental rights or whether the surrogacy contract is actually enforceable. Or you could even face legal challenges when you're trying to bring the baby back to your home country. Having a good legal team that specializes in Mexican surrogacy law is, like, non-negotiable.
So navigating the legal side of things can be a bit of a minefield. You definitely don't want to go into it blindly.
Definitely not.
Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the cost. We all know surrogacy can be incredibly expensive. The source mentions that there are some pretty significant cost differences between Mexico and other countries. Can you break that down a bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. What they found is that a standard surrogacy program in Mexico can run you somewhere between like $56,000 and $60,000.
Hmm.
Now, if you compare that to similar programs in the US or Canada, which can easily go up to $150,000 or more, we're talking about some potentially huge savings, almost like 69% less.
Wow, that's a huge difference. What factors contribute to that lower cost in Mexico? Is it just like a lower cost of living overall?
I mean, that's definitely part of it. The cost of medical care and just general expenses tend to be lower in Mexico compared to North America. But it goes beyond that, too. For example, things like legal fees and agency fees are often lower in Mexico, and the compensation for surrogates is typically lower as well.
I see. So it's like a combination of factors. Now, even though the overall cost might be lower in Mexico, I imagine there are still a lot of moving pieces financially.
Yeah.
How does the payment usually work? Like, is it one lump sum or?
Well, the source actually breaks down the typical payment structure in quite a bit of detail, which is surprisingly transparent. It's usually done in several installments.
Oh, okay.
So it starts with an initial deposit to, get the ball rolling. And then there are payments for different stages, things like matching you with a surrogate, legal fees, IVF treatment, and then, of course, the ongoing care for the surrogate throughout the pregnancy.
That's interesting that you mentioned the transparency of the payment structure. You don't always see that in these kinds of situations.
You're right. It's not always the norm. Transparency is really key here because it builds trust and makes sure everyone's on the same page financially. But it's important to remember that even with the best planning, there could still be unexpected costs that pop up along the way. Like you might have travel expenses, unforeseen medical complications, maybe even additional legal fees. You just never know.
So even though the upfront costs might look attractive, you can't just focus on that initial quote. You need to factor in the potential for additional expenses as well. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and talk about security and safeguards. I imagine this is a big concern for anyone considering surrogacy, especially in a different country.
Oh, absolutely. It's a top priority. And it's something that reputable agencies and clinics in Mexico take very seriously. The source we're looking at actually outlines some of the key safety measures that are in place. For instance, surrogates have to undergo a really rigorous screening process, including medical evaluations, psychological assessments, background checks, the whole works.
Okay, so they're really vetting the surrogates thoroughly. But what about the, sperm samples themselves? Are there any specific measures taken to make sure those are handled safely and properly?
Yes, definitely. They have a mandatory 3-month quarantine period for all sperm samples.
Wow, 3 months.
Yeah, it's all designed to detect any potential infections or issues that might not be immediately apparent. I know it seems like a long time, but it's all about prioritizing safety and minimizing any potential risks.
3 months does seem like quite a wait, especially when you're ready to get the process going. But I suppose it's better to be safe than sorry, especially with something as sensitive as this.
Exactly. And that quarantine period also allows them to do more testing and analysis just to make sure the quality and safety standards are as high as possible.
Okay, so we've covered the legal landscape, the financial side of things, and the security measures that are in place. I think we've got a pretty good foundation now. So let's actually dive into the surrogacy process itself. What does that journey look like from start to finish?
Well, it all begins with an initial consultation. This is where the intended parents meet with the agency or clinic to go over their medical history, explore the different options available, and probably most importantly, ask any questions they might have. Welcome back to our deep dive on surrogacy in Mexico. Last we left off, we were talking about that initial consultation, kind of that first step in the whole process.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, especially for someone who's just starting to, wrap their head around all this. What happens after that initial consultation?
So, assuming things go well in that first meeting, the next step usually involves like a more in-depth look at the intended parent's medical history. That's where the clinic will, go through their medical records, maybe order some additional tests, and start figuring out a personalized treatment plan.
So it's really about making sure the approach is tailored to the specific needs of each intended parent.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about the surrogate? When does that part of the process come in?
Good question. The timing can vary a bit, but usually once the clinic has a good understanding of the intended parent situation, they'll start the search for a suitable surrogate.
I imagine finding the right surrogate is a pretty delicate process. How does that usually work in Mexico?
It can be. Reputable agencies usually have like these extensive databases of potential surrogates who've already gone through that rigorous screening process we talked about earlier. And these databases typically include detailed profiles with information about the surrogate's medical history, lifestyle, their motivations for wanting to be a surrogate, that kind of thing.
So it's not just about finding someone who's medically compatible, but also someone who's a good fit in terms of values and expectations.
Absolutely. Finding that right match is super important for a successful surrogacy journey. And it's a two-way street, too. The potential surrogate also gets to look at profiles of intended parents and decide if they feel comfortable moving forward.
Oh, so both sides have a say in the matching process. What happens once they identify a potential match? Do they just jump straight into contract negotiations?
Not quite. There's usually a getting to know you phase,
What?
where the intended parents and the surrogate can chat, ask questions, and get a sense of each other's personalities.
Okay, so it's like a trial period before making any commitments.
Yeah, exactly. It might involve video calls, emails, maybe even in-person meetings if possible. It's about building rapport and trust before getting into the legal stuff.
That makes sense. So once they've established that connection and both sides are happy, then the lawyers come in to start drawing up the contract.
Right, and that contract needs to be super thorough. It has to cover everything from parental rights and the surrogate's compensation to medical expenses, insurance, and what happens if there are complications during the pregnancy.
It sounds like it's like laying out a roadmap for the whole journey to avoid any surprises down the line.
Exactly. It's about protecting everyone involved and making sure everyone's on the same page.
We talked earlier about how surrogacy laws in Mexico can vary from state to state. Does that affect the content of the contract?
It absolutely does. The lawyers drafting the contract need to be experts in the laws of the specific state where the surrogacy is taking place.
Right, because the contract has to comply with all the local regulations.
Exactly. And they also need to make sure the intended parent's parental rights will be recognized not just in Mexico, but in their home country as well.
It sounds incredibly complicated. I'm starting to understand why having a good legal team is so crucial.
Oh, yeah, it can get very complex very quickly. You definitely don't want to try and navigate this alone.
Okay, so let's say the contract is all signed, everyone's happy. What's next?
Typically, the next step is a final round of medical and psychological evaluations for both the intended parents and the surrogate, just to confirm that everyone's healthy and ready to proceed.
So there's a lot of checks and balances built into the process.
Yep, it's all about minimizing risks and making sure everything goes as smoothly as possible.
Now, we talked about that 3-month quarantine for sperm samples, but what about the actual IVF process? Does that usually happen in Mexico too?
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Mexico has a lot of good fertility clinics that specialize in IVF and surrogacy. They usually have top-notch technology and experienced doctors.
So the intended parents wouldn't necessarily have to keep traveling back and forth between Mexico and their home country.
Not always. Of course, the exact logistics depend on the situation, but a lot of clinics offer these all-inclusive packages that cover pretty much every step of the journey, from the initial consultation all the way to postpartum care for both the surrogate and the baby.
Okay, so that streamlines things quite a bit. What about the embryo transfer itself? That must be a big moment.
It is. It's kind of like the culmination of all that preparation. The actual procedure is usually pretty straightforward. They use a thin catheter to transfer the embryos into the surrogate's uterus.
And then the waiting game begins.
Right. It's a mix of excitement and nerves for sure. The surrogate will usually have a blood test about 10 days after the transfer to check for pregnancy hormones. And if that's positive, they'll do an ultrasound a few weeks later to make sure everything's looking good.
Let's say we get a positive pregnancy test and everything's progressing well. What happens during those months leading up to the birth?
Well, the surrogate will get regular prenatal care just like any other pregnant woman. Doctor's appointments, ultrasounds, all the usual stuff. And the intended parents are usually kept updated on how things are going.
I imagine communication is really important during this time, especially if the intended parents are living in a different country.
Oh, absolutely. Open communication is key. It helps build trust between everyone involved and creates a more supportive environment.
Now, we've been talking a lot about the intended parents, but I'm curious about the surrogate's experience during this time. What kind of support do they get throughout the pregnancy?
Good agencies and clinics really prioritize the well-being of the surrogate. They usually provide a lot of support, like access to medical care, counseling services, even financial help if needed. They also encourage open communication between the surrogate and the intended parents.
That's good to hear. It's easy to forget that the surrogate is playing such an important role in all of this.
It's a huge act of generosity, and their well-being should be protected every step of the way.
Okay, so the pregnancy's going well, and we're getting closer to the due date. What happens when the baby is actually born?
The details can vary, but usually the intended parents will travel to Mexico to be there for the birth. They'll be at the hospital, ready to welcome their child into the world.
I can only imagine how emotional that moment must be.
It's a powerful experience to be there, witnessing the birth of their child after everything they've been through. It's really life-changing.
What about the surrogate? What happens to them after the birth?
They receive really good care after the birth, too. The clinic or hospital will monitor their recovery, give them any medical support they need, and make sure they're doing okay, both physically and emotionally.
So her well-being is still a priority even after the baby is born.
Yes, definitely. And good agencies will continue to offer support even after she leaves the hospital, things like follow-up appointments, counseling, that sort of thing.
So it's not just about the baby. It's about making sure the surrogate is taken care of too. Now we've got the baby. The intended parents are overjoyed. The surrogate's recovering. What's next? How do they actually get the baby back home?
That's where those legal complexities we talked about earlier come back into play. Remember how important it is to have a solid legal team in Mexico?
Yes, and how the laws can be different depending on the state.
Right. So the process of getting all the legal documents for the baby will depend on where the surrogacy took place.
This is where that pre-birth parental court order would come in handy.
You got it. In places like Mexico City, where they have that court order, the intended parents' names can actually be listed right on the Mexican birth certificate, which makes things a lot easier when it comes to getting passports and all the other paperwork.
That sounds like a huge advantage. But even with the court order, I imagine there's still some red tape to deal with, especially for international travel.
You're right. Even if their names are on the Mexican birth certificate, they still have to make sure they meet all the requirements for their home country, to legally recognize them as the parents and to get citizenship for the baby.
So there might be some additional legal steps once they get back home.
Exactly. It's really important for intended parents to talk to lawyers in both Mexico and their home country to make sure the transition goes smoothly.
It sounds like coordinating all of this is pretty intense.
It can be. That's why working with experienced and reputable agencies and lawyers is so crucial. They can really guide you through the whole process and make sure everything is done correctly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive so far. We've talked about the legal side, the financial side, the emotional journey, even the logistics of bringing the baby home. It's been fascinating to learn about all of this.
It really is a complex process with a lot of moving parts.
But our deep dive isn't over yet. We still need to look ahead and see what the future might hold for surrogacy in Mexico. Welcome back. So we've spent a lot of time digging into the current state of surrogacy in Mexico. But things are always evolving, right? What do you see on the horizon for surrogacy in Mexico, looking ahead?
Well, one of the biggest things is just the overall global demand. It's growing rapidly.
Why do you think that is?
I think there are a couple of reasons. More and more individuals and couples are struggling with infertility, for one. And, societal views on family are changing, becoming more open to different structures. So surrogacy is becoming a more accepted and sought after option for people.
So given that, do you think Mexico is going to stay a popular destination for intended parents?
I do, yeah. They've got a lot going for them. Proximity to the US and Canada, those more affordable costs we talked about, and, that legal framework that, while it still needs some work, is becoming more established.
Right, and we did talk a lot about that legal framework, how it's kind of a work in progress. Do you see any specific changes or improvements happening soon?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, that 2021 Supreme Court decision was huge, but there's still a lot of room for improvement in terms of clarity and consistency across the different states. I think we'll probably see more legislation aimed at, harmonizing those regulations and just making the process smoother overall.
That makes sense. It would certainly make things easier for everyone involved. What about the role of agencies? Do you think that's going to change at all?
Oh, I think it's going to become even more important. As the demand goes up, it's going to be absolutely crucial for intended parents to find those really reputable agencies, the ones with a strong track record of ethical practices and, really open communication. They're going to be the ones who can guide people through the complexities of this whole thing, advocate for their rights, and make sure everyone's being treated fairly.
So really doing your research on agencies is more critical than ever. Beyond the legal and regulatory stuff, what other trends do you see shaping the future of surrogacy in Mexico?
Well, technology is always a big factor. We're going to see more and more advancements in reproductive tech, things like even more sophisticated screening for both surrogates and embryos, which, could lead to higher success rates, healthier babies, all that.
That's great. It seems like science is always pushing things forward, trying to make the process safer and more effective.
For sure. And I think we might also see some changes in how intended parents and surrogates connect and communicate, thanks to technology. Virtual consultations, online support groups, things like that could make it a lot easier for people to get the information and support they need, regardless of location.
So in a way, technology could help bring people together and make surrogacy feel less isolating, even if they're spread out geographically. But with all this progress, are there any potential downsides or challenges we should be thinking about?
Absolutely. Whenever you have something becoming more accessible, especially with technology involved, you have to be extra careful about the ethical implications. We need to make sure surrogates are being treated fairly, that we're protecting the rights of the children, and that we're not creating a system where people are being exploited.
That's such an important point. We don't want to sacrifice ethics for the sake of progress. How can we make sure surrogacy in Mexico, and really globally, evolves in a way that's responsible and ethical?
Open communication and collaboration are going to be key. We need everyone involved, legal experts, medical professionals, ethicists, policymakers, and of course, intended parents and surrogates themselves. We need them all to be part of the conversation and share their perspectives.
So a multifaceted approach is really what's needed to make sure everyone benefits from this evolving landscape.
Exactly. We have to work together to create a system that's transparent, that's equitable, and that safeguards the well-being of everyone involved.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. This deep dive into surrogacy in Mexico has been so informative. We've really gone through the ins and outs of it all, the legalities, the financial aspects, the emotional journey, the future trends. It's been a lot to take in, but so important.
It really has, and I think it highlights how complex and nuanced this whole area is.
Absolutely. And to our listeners out there, we hope this has given you a better understanding of surrogacy in Mexico and what to think about if you're exploring this option. It's a big decision, and it's one that requires careful thought, thorough research, and, the support of experienced professionals. Thanks for joining us.